Welcome to Nature's Guardians. I'm Micah Siegel. Each week, I talk with people working to save and help animals around the world. They are nature's guardians, and you can become one too. Today, I'm talking with Jules Wilkinson from the International Wolf Center. Welcome to the show, Jules.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. So, what's the hot topic on wolves right now?
Okay, so right now I'm coming from Ely, Minnesota, so we're really close to the Canadian border. And most recently, our deer hunt in this area just ended with some pretty low numbers of take. So basically, what we're seeing is that over time, less and less deer are actually being hunted by people. A lot of that is kind of getting directed onto the wolves. They're saying that the wolves are kind of the problem. Of course, wolves hunt deer, right? But what we're actually seeing is some other really important factors coming into play. One of those being winter severity. So we had a really severe winter last year with lots and lots of snow. And thinking about it from a deer's perspective, they have to dig through all that snow to find food. So a lot of the deer were not able to survive. Therefore, a lot of them were not able to have more deer and create that bigger population. And so less deer were taken. But if we actually look at the numbers of deer taken per hunter, that hasn't decreased as much. So what we're seeing is that it's not really the wolves. There's a couple of other factors coming in: winter severity and the number of people hunting. So it's just kind of this problem of people having a little bit of misunderstanding and not being able to really see the more scientific side of things. So they need each other to be able to balance.
How do wolves affect each?
They do that in a lot of different ways, but the most important is that they are predators. So they're going to be taking other animals. When they do that, though, they're selective hunters generally. So that means that they're going to go after a vulnerable member of that herd. Maybe it's older, younger, sick, or weak in some way. And by doing that, they, of course, are taking animals from that population, but they're helping to keep those populations healthier by removing those weaker individuals. So when there is a good density of wolves, we see healthier ungulate populations, healthier hoofed mammals like deer and moose. They also will help to affect the ecosystem for other animals like scavengers. So things like ravens, foxes, bears, and coyotes will oftentimes feed off of wolf kills. So those are some of the ways that they might affect an ecosystem.
So, can you give us an overview of wolf populations in the US and Canada?
So what this is showing us is that every state that's blue is where gray wolves are there. That doesn't mean they're all over that state, but they're at least present in that state. Previously, before about the 1950s, wolves were everywhere in the US. So what happened is that as Europeans came over here, they kind of brought with them that mentality of fear of wolves and just trying to kind of eradicate them. So past the 1950s, the only place in the lower 48 states to have wolves was where I am in northern Minnesota, that little tip. So as we can see today, they've been able to kind of recolonize a lot of that area. So right now, pretty stable population within the US. Here in Minnesota, we have the highest population in the lower 48 states of around 2,700. But out in Alaska, they have somewhere around 11. So it's quite a big population over there as well. So within the US, they're doing pretty well. That does not mean that they're probably ever going to get back to that original historical range, but they might be able to recolonize some of those other areas, or through reintroductions like the ones in Yellowstone and Arizona and New Mexico, us humans might be able to help them get back to some of those areas as well. Overall, gray wolves are doing well in the US and in Canada, but there's still certain types of the gray wolf, like the Mexican gray wolf, that are trying to recover.
So, tell us about the reintroductions of wolves in other states. How's that going?
So the most famous one is going to be the one in Yellowstone, and that started in 1995. So we're coming up on the 30-year anniversary. And from what we can see, that's a pretty successful reintroduction. It's not ever going to probably get to the amount of wolves that the park could ecologically support, but what we're seeing there is kind of like what we talked about. Wolves are helping to balance those ungulate populations. So before, when they were no longer in the park, a lot of like the elk herds weren't doing very well because there was too many of them. So there wasn't enough food to go around. So with the wolves back in the park, they've been able to kind of help keep those populations more in check. And then in Arizona, New Mexico, that's going to be the Mexican gray wolves. Last time I checked, there's somewhere around 240 of them in the Arizona, New Mexico range. And there's more down in Mexico as well. So I think that one's really unique because it is a collaboration between the US and Mexico to try to get those wolves back into the ecosystem. But we're going to have to wait to see how that one actually is able to continue.
What lessons have you learned from reintroducing wolves?
I think we've learned that they are a really important part of their ecosystem, not any more than any other animal, but because we did remove them from those ecosystems, we've been kind of able to see what those effects really are. And what we're learning is that we need every animal and every part of that ecosystem to be there for it to function.
So I spend a lot of time in Colorado. What can you tell us about wolves in Colorado?
Yeah, that's probably a really hot topic right now. And that's because they just started the reintroduction. So it's been in the works for a couple of years, kind of going back and forth on whether or not they really wanted to do it, where they wanted to do it, and how they wanted to do that. So they were able to get 5 wolves from Oregon that they reintroduced on Monday. Actually, our wolves just popped out. So I'm going to take you over here real quick to see if we can see them as they run by. But they're up on top of the hill. I don't know if you can see them over there.
I see them.
Okay, so that's our pack. That's actually all of them. They're chasing. So they're doing what we call a focus chase. So they're chasing one of our younger males. They'll pop back around eventually, but there they are. I just want to make sure that we can see them. But yeah, so Colorado is going to be something we have to keep an eye on. I honestly don't know how it's going to go. I don't think really anybody does. It's difficult to put wolves back into an area where they haven't been there in a really long time. And I'm assuming and have heard that it's a big concern for ranchers and hunters in that area, as well as just the people who live there. So I think it's going to be a lot about being able to manage wildlife, but also people and kind of finding that balance.
So, what are some of the biggest threats to wolves today?
Some of the biggest threats to wolves today are unfortunately people. A lot of times we might hunt them or we might do something a little bit more indirect, like we're changing where they're living. Wolves, they are neophobic. So that means that they're naturally afraid of new things. So when we change their habitats too drastically or too rapidly, they're not able to survive in those areas. So a really key thing for wolves to be able to survive is just human tolerance. We don't need to love them or even like them, but just allow them to coexist with us here on the planet. So I think at the end of the day, we're kind of the biggest issue for them, but also things like other wolves can be a threat to them or disease as well.
So, what does your organization do exactly?
Yeah. So the really important thing about the International Wolf Center is that we're here for education. So we're here to get the true scientific information about wolves out there to the public. And we're also here to do that in a non-advocacy way. So we're not here to tell anybody how to feel or think about wolves, just to give them that scientific information so they can make up their own decisions.
So, tell us a bunch of things, maybe biological facts about wolves that we don't know yet.
So I think some of the most important stuff is just starting with the basics about wolves. So what do they eat? Because that's something we talk about a lot, right? Wolves are predators. Their main source of food everywhere is generally ungulates, hooved mammals. So things like deer and moose, caribou, bison, but they'll also eat other things too. So this is the diet we see here in Minnesota, mostly made up of those ungulates, white-tailed deer and moose, but also smaller animals too, like beaver and snowshoe hare. And in the other category, that little 2% chunk, we're seeing things like birds, fish, squirrels, but also blueberries. So though wolves, they are carnivores, they have to have meat in their diet to survive. Oftentimes they'll eat other things like blueberries too. But when they are going after things like deer and moose, there's a pretty big size difference. So most wolves on average weigh about 60 to 110 pounds, whereas moose weigh over 1,000 pounds. Even white-tailed deer are about 200. So there's a really big size difference. So wolves, they have some specific adaptations, things about their bodies and behaviors that help them to survive. And they're all pretty unique. First up, wolves are crepuscular. This means they're most active at dawn and dusk, and they're most active at dawn and dusk because the things that they're hunting, deer and moose, are also crepuscular. So just like we don't want to go to the grocery store when it's closed, wolves don't want to be up and around unless their food is up and around. Wolves also have extremely large paws. They're generally about the size of an adult human hand, and in between their toes, they have interdigital webbing. And that webbing, along with the size, helps to redistribute their weights and kind of act like snowshoes that helps them stay on top of the snow and deal with difficult terrain. And then they have some pretty cool adaptations within their actual skulls. Their teeth are really important to be able to help them hunt down these animals. So things that are super cool about their teeth is that the canine teeth, those big yellow ones on the diagram, they're embedded a full another inch into the jaw so that when they're grasping onto things like deer and moose, their teeth won't fall out. And then the really big ones in the back that are red, those are called their carnassials. And they're used like a pair of scissors to help shear meat right off the bone and even crack open those bones to get to marrow. And they have very impressive stamina and speed. So wolves, they are stalk and pursuit predators when they're going after things like deer and moose. That means they're going to try to tire them out over really long distances over a really long time. They can run 38 miles per hour, which is about how fast we drive a car through town. And they can keep that speed up for 20 minutes. So in 20 minutes, wolves can run about 12.6 miles, which is half of a marathon. And they've been reported pursuing one animal for up to 9 hours before actually making a kill. Then, like we talked about, they're selective hunters. So they go after the old, the young, the sick, and the weak. And that makes it easier for them, but also a lot less dangerous. I think it's hard for us sometimes to think about that deer and moose can also be a pretty big threat. They oftentimes injure and kill wolves. So for wolves, by going after the weaker members of those herds, it makes it a lot safer for them and easier. The other thing that's going to make it easier and safer for them is being social carnivores. They live in packs and they hunt in packs. So I think a really important thing to talk about is, what does a pack look like? Because there's kind of this misconception that we've heard of with the word alpha before. So we don't use the term alpha anymore in the scientific community because it kind of gives us this idea that the strongest, toughest wolf had to fight their way to the top, when in fact, it's normally just mom and dad. So most packs out in the wild, they're just a family unit. They're made up of mom and dad and their offspring. We use the term dominant male and dominant female, or breeding pair or dominant pair, to kind of refer to them now. And normally it's more of a partnership, and they are in charge just because they're the parents of the rest of the members of the pack. So they know the most and they have the most experience. But they're social carnivores, so that means that they live in those packs, and they also hunt in those packs, and they have to work together to do that. So to work together, they have to be able to communicate with each other. So wolves communicate in 3 main ways. The first is through vocalizations. So I'm sure you've probably heard of howling, but wolves can also bark and whimper and whine and growl and snarl. And all these different vocalizations have a lot of different meanings, and they help them to communicate over short and long distances. Body language is extremely important for wolves. It's one of the things that we watch most closely here with our wolves at the center. We watch their tail positions, their ear positions, how they're baring their teeth, how they're looking at each other, and how they're even touching each other to know kind of what they're trying to communicate to one another. So here in this picture, we have a couple of our wolves. And you can see the one wolf, the really high tail, he's got his chin resting on the other one's back. And that's called a chin rest. By doing that, he's dominance posturing. So he's saying, hey, I am in charge. And the wolf on the bottom there, you can see that he's listening because his ears are pointed back, his eyes are pointed down, and it's a little hard to see, but his tail is tucked all the way in between his legs. So he is submitting. He's saying, okay, you can be in charge. So a lot of these very small things to us can actually mean quite a bit to wolves. And finally, wolves communicate through olfaction or scent. So they will mark their territories by pooping and peeing all over the place, but they can also individually recognize those scents. So a wolf that's in a pack might be able to track down their brother or their mom by smelling for them. And then maybe if they smell something that they don't know, that means that a wolf might be in their territory that's not part of their pack. And wolves are very territorial. They oftentimes will chase out or even kill other wolves because they have to be protective of that space, because that's where they get their food and where they have their families.
What are wolves related to?
Well, wolves are part of the family Canidae. So that's going to be anything that's like a canine. So foxes, dogs, coyotes, even other things on different continents like dingoes or even the Ethiopian wolf. So they're related to all different kinds of canines, but most closely related to dogs. We're not exactly sure how we domesticated dogs yet. We think they came directly from gray wolves, but they might have also come from a common ancestor between the two.
Do you know anything about the wolf pet trade?
Yeah. So a lot of times people want to have a wolf as a pet or a wolf hybrid, which is like part dog, part wolf. Not a great idea. So the thing about wolves is that, like we talked about, they're neophobic. So they're afraid of new things. Our wolves here, even though I work with them and they know me well, I can clap or make a really loud noise and that might scare them and they run away. That might not seem like a big deal, right? An animal can be scared, but sometimes that fear can redirect into aggression. So most of the time, people that have wolves or wolf hybrids as a pet end up surrendering them to a rescue organization or euthanizing them. So most of the time, it doesn't end up well. And that's because wolves are not meant to be pets.
So tell us about your ambassador wolves.
We have 5 ambassador wolves that live with us here at the center, and they're just here as educational ambassadors to help teach people about their species. So we have Axel and Grayson. They're our current 2 oldest ambassadors. They were born on May 2nd, 2016. So these 2, they might look a little bit different than what we're thinking of as a classic gray wolf because they have that white coat coloring. So gray wolves, they can be white, black, brown, gray, or anywhere in between. Over time, wolves in the Arctic have evolved to be close to all white, if not all white, to help them camouflage. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen one more time because conveniently Axel is right here. So I'm going to take you to see if we can see him. So that's Axel. He is the tallest and widest wolf that we have, but he doesn't weigh the most. He weighs about 100 pounds. Hi, buddy. So now that's right. Okay. And then next up, we have Rika. So Rika, she's the only female or the only girl wolf we have here in the pack. And so that automatically makes her our dominant female. So here at the Wolf Center, we don't have a breeding program. So all of our wolves have been fixed. So what that kind of looks like is her forming a pair bond, which is a social relationship and an alliance. So they kind of become partners, and that's left up to Rika. So she is still kind of in the midst of deciding which of our males she might want to pair bond with and create that alliance with. And then last but not least, we have Blackstone and Kaz. So they were our pups last year. So they're now both about 1.5 years old. So they're not mature like Rika, but they're not quite pups anymore either. We call them yearlings. And as yearlings, they're juveniles. They're kind of like teenagers trying to figure out where they fit in our pack. So those were the 2 that were chasing each other around a little bit earlier this morning.
So tell us about wolves in Canada.
I will say I'm not an expert on wolves in Canada, but from what I understand, they're doing very well up there. And I think that's because a lot less people and a lot more space. So wolves, in addition to being neophobic, afraid of new things, are also naturally fearful of people. So up in Canada, there's a lot more space for them to be able to kind of exist where there aren't a lot of people and we haven't changed the ecosystem as much. I'm assuming that it's an extremely high population up there.
Okay, so tell us about the wolf programs that you do.
We do a lot of different programs like daily. Every single day we've got presentations like we were just kind of doing. But then in addition, we also have special programming. We have people come up here to do different things like the Wolves and Women's Weekend, which is specifically women coming up to learn more about wolves and do wine tasting and go dog sledding. And then we also have more kind of family-oriented ones, which are called Wolf Family Rendezvous. And so people come to the center and they get private presentations and private kind of games and activities to do. And then we also have like a kid camp, which is called Junior Wolf Biologist. So children who are interested in kind of what that looks like, more studying wolves and kind of working in the wildlife field can get a better idea of what that might be like. And the best way to do that is probably through our Wildlife Career Day. And that one is really focused towards maybe high schoolers or young college students that might be thinking about joining the wildlife career field. We do offer specific special behind the scenes programs to our members. So that's kind of the closest way you can interact with our wolves. There'll be no touching or anything like that because like we talked about, wolves are still naturally afraid of people. And even though our wolves do interact with our care staff, they are still naturally afraid of new people. So they get to know them through the fence a little bit, but no touching. So we just offer a lot of different ways to learn about them and have fun up here at the center.
So tell us about your fellowship program.
It's a way that you can go do research with wolves and kind of get that funding, which is really important. So our most recent fellow, he was working with Voyager's Wolf Project, which is one of our main partners. They do a lot of really cool wolf research up there. And so he was able to study with them. So I think that the really unique thing about that is that it is a way that you can just directly get into the field because a lot of times it's really difficult to get these kinds of jobs. So the fellowship just offers funding as well as partners that you can work with to start to do different wolf research. And they normally focus on kind of the most important thing that might be lacking from our research happening right now.
What are the biggest misconceptions about wolves?
I think some of the biggest misconceptions about wolves is that they might be like very aggressive or they might be like bloodthirsty or something like that. And of course, they do kill animals, that's how they eat. But I think the really important thing to remember is that most humans also do too. We also eat hamburgers and stuff like that. So wolves, I think a lot of times we think of them as either this really scary thing like the big bad wolf we learned about in Little Red Riding Hood, when in fact they're just an animal trying to survive. So they're just out there in their ecosystem living. That's all they're doing. So I think a lot of times we either think of them in that really negative light or maybe a little bit too positive. So sometimes we think about them as the heroes of the story. They come in and they rescue the whole ecosystem. Not exactly how it works either. They're just animals trying to survive. So I think kind of the most important thing is getting to the neutral ground and looking at it from the scientific perspective.
Are some wolf populations endangered?
Yeah. So overall, gray wolves, their global population is somewhere around 200,000 to 250,000. But like we were talking about with the Mexican gray wolves, they're still considered endangered. And then there can be certain locations, like in Colorado. Technically, they were there at one point, but we removed them. So it's kind of difficult to say because overall, they're doing great. But in certain locations where maybe humans have taken away too much of their habitat or overhunted them, they're not. It's just looking at which areas and which types of the gray wolf need the most help.
So, what do you see for wolves in the next 30 years?
That's a really complicated question. I don't know if they're going to be able to expand much past where they are, at least here in the US. We've changed a lot of the habitat and there's just a lot of people in the way. So I think that ideally in the next 30 years, we would just find more ways to coexist with them. So, figuring out ways of keeping wolves away from livestock through non-lethal methods. And then also making sure that we are educating people with the right scientific background to understand what's really happening with them. So I think in the next 30 years, ideally, wolves would stop being seen as a villain, stop being seen as a hero, and just be seen as an animal that's trying to survive in the ecosystem.
Thank you for talking with me, Jules, and thank you for watching. You can help animals by hitting the like button and subscribing to this channel. I'll see you next time on Nature's Guardians. Bye.